and says recording in progress. I'd like to remind everybody to please mute. And I'll be right with you here. Okay. I assume that we'll still be expecting some more folks, but we have enough to get started, I think. Welcome to another free Zoom program presented by Sons and Daughters of Holocaust Survivors of Greater Philadelphia. We're among the first second-generation groups in the United States, founded in 1979. We are an active, vibrant, and welcoming organization. And if you are a child of survivors and you're interested in joining, please drop me a note or drop a note to our birthday woman. And we'll make sure that you join our organization. We know where hatred leads. Somebody is not muted.
You can mute everyone.
Oh, that's what I'll do then. That's what I'll do.
You have the power.
You know what? I'll do that. Okay, I see who that was. That person will be disciplined later. Today's program is our 7th in an ongoing series, always at 2 p.m. Eastern Time on Sundays. And we have one more scheduled before the end of the year. Please mark your calendars. 2 p.m. Sunday, December 3rd, from Maryland, Christopher Simpson will make a rare public appearance. He wrote this 1988 masterpiece of investigative journalism, Blowback, the first full account of America's recruitment of Nazis and its disastrous effect on our domestic and foreign policy. And he will share exclusively with us his latest research into the subject he has titled White Christian Nationalism and the Crisis in American Political and Cultural Life, a subject as timely as the latest news out of Washington with Wednesday's election of Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, who spent more than 2 decades defending conservative Christian causes as a litigator at the legal advocacy group Alliance Defending Freedom, arguing in court and drafting legislation to outlaw same-sex marriage and restrict abortion. Joining Christopher Simpson on this program from Detroit will be another expert on the issue, Russ Belant, author of Old Nazis, the New Right, and the Republican Party, which has gone through 3 editions, and the 1996 book, The Religious Right in Michigan Politics. That's 2 p.m. Sunday, December 3rd. Please make plans to attend this important program. The link will be the same as the one you're using today. Thank you. When we planned today's program, we intended to present author Judy Rakowsky from Massachusetts and from Florida, her 99-year-old cousin, survivor Sam Ron, to discuss her newly published book, Jews in the garden. A Holocaust survivor, the fate of his family, and the secret history of Poland in World War II. Sadly, 20 days ago, Sam died. And we extend our condolences to Judy on the death of her beloved cousin, who taught her so much. And we dedicate today's program to his memory. In addition to that unforeseen circumstance, after we scheduled this program came the deadly terror attack on Saturday, October 7th, by Hamas into the south of Israel, where Judy's stepson is deployed as a captain in the reserves. We appreciate his service, and we hope he stays safe. Judy and I were introduced recently by our mutual friend and colleague, Sue Warner. And it turns out we've had similar career paths. Both of us spent decades on Deadline as newspaper journalists covering crime and legal affairs. In my case, it was mainly here in Philly. And in Judy's case, it was at the Boston Globe and the Providence Journal. Unlike me and many of us, she is not a child of survivors. She grew up in Ohio and really knew very little about her family's Holocaust story until she got to know her cousin Sam, a survivor of the Krakow ghetto and Nazi camps, who got married in Israel after the war and then raised a family in Ohio. As a journalist and as a relative, Judy was driven to discover the fate of her family in Poland. She and Sam traveled there together many times, learning much in the process, but also running up against the official Polish government efforts to distort our history. Jews in the Garden was published in July to overwhelming rave reviews, and this is only her second public appearance since Sam died. Her book tour took her to LA last week. This program will last about an hour, during which you'll have an opportunity to ask questions, and it is being recorded. Please make sure that you are muted. And now I'm honored to turn the program over to Judy Rakowsky. If I can recall how I did it before.
Hover.
Oh yeah. That's a very, very good hint. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today with you. I typically start my presentations with the question in broader audiences of how many of you are connected to this piece of history, to the Holocaust. And even in some Jewish audiences, people don't always raise their hand. And I want to say, well, you don't think you do, but you may have more of a connection than you think. And my second question that I'd be interested to see whether you show your hands or nod is how many of you have questions that you wish you would have learned the answers to when a relative was alive, and whether they weren't forthcoming or only later did you become interested. I feel like that's our universal bond, because we all want to know where we came from. We want to know, it really, going back to, the first time when they showed, you remember the series, The Holocaust, that's when everybody first started to get more aware in this country. There was a mini series, and it wasn't even a word that we used until along about then. And ever since then, this is long before all the, genealogy that's just cropped up and is such a phenomenon now. So, I grew up, as David said, in a place you may never have seen yourselves, Lima, Ohio. It's in Northwest Ohio. And, I got there because my grandfather left Poland in 1913 and was sent to Galveston, Texas to fill swamps. It's not your typical American Jewish story, but no one else from, our extended family in Poland left. He was the only one. And I just, grew up on that story about the great melting pot, and we're all just Americans. And in 5th grade, I remember the teacher said, well, none of us are from here. Where does your family come from? And most of the class just shrugged. They didn't have that identity that we find is much stronger as you move toward the East Coast in particular. And I raised my hand and I said, I'm of Polish Jewish descent. And everybody's like, what? So after school, I'm in the carpool, and somehow I said it again. I wasn't a very quiet kid. And the carpool mom turned to me and she said, you should not fib. Everybody knows all Poles are Catholic. Why would you say that? And I'm thinking, why would I make that up? It's not exactly something you would just come up with. And why, what was I going to get out of it? Anyway, that was my first sort of realization that, there was anything different. I was very young. And then, I didn't know my cousin Sam growing up. He was like a quieter guy at large family gatherings. My father was more outgoing and, wearing loud golf clothes and, smoking a Lucky Strike. And Sam was over in the corner with the other people from the old country and, speaking Yiddish, and I didn't really notice it all. But then when I had my first job at the plane dealer in Cleveland, I got to know him and his family a little bit because they were living in Canton. I don't know if any of these places are familiar to you guys, but and then I went to Passover one year at their house when I was a young reporter at a small paper. And I kept looking at my cousin Sam because I was hoping he was going to be like my grandfather and skip pages. But his wife was in charge and we did every word, and it went on for a very long time. And finally I thought, okay, I got to get back to my story. I got a long drive ahead. Thought the evening was winding down. And Sam jumps up like a different guy, takes paintings off the walls and pulls out this big slide deck. Remember slide projectors and those big wheels? And I thought, we're going to be here all night. And he said, let me show you where you come from, Kazimierza Wielka, Poland. And he said it like he was talking about some fancy place on the Riviera or something. And so we sit back and he shows these images that to him looked glorious. And I saw the kind of gray, commie, forlorn scenes that, was what Poland definitely looked like in the early 80s when he first returned after not seeing Poland since he left in 45. Because after he survived, he was a member of the Brcha. I don't know if you're familiar with the Brcha, but he was smuggling Jewish orphans across European borders to go to Palestine. And it was dangerous. They had to, nobody had any papers. And that's a whole glorious chapter that I did not write about. Oh, you have someone that's spoken on that.
That's a book by Yehuda Bauer.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yehuda Bauer. Anyway, so Sam had gone, one of the most salient points for this crowd in particular is that both of his parents survived, which was extremely rare. And, his father was, in terrible shape in Mauthausen when they were liberated, and his mother, they separately survived, and they were in a DP camp. And then my grandfather wound up sponsoring them, for to come to the US with the small group of survivors. And Sam went to what was then called Palestine with one of those, boats of hundreds of young orphans. And he stayed in Israel, and he married a Sabra. And the vibe then was, let's forget the dark days of Europe. They got married. He left his surname. He left the Rakowsky name back in Europe, and they both took the surname Ron, which is Hebrew for joy, part of the incredible, optimism of the time. And they were building a new country. And it was only later that he moved to the United States. They tried to move back and forth, and it was the twin guilt trips of two sets of parents that they had to leave one or the other. Anyway, that night he showed these images, and I'm going to now show you the cover of the book, which is, can everybody see that? So the cover of the book shows, those are my great grandparents, and there's just above the R in garden is Sam as a 2-year-old, in a little sailor suit, and they're posing in front of our family lumberyard. It was a wedding. The wedding couple was being photographed somewhere else, and this was how proud they were of the lumberyard, and that's where they posed. And so he that night regaled us with, that was the first time I ever heard my great grandfather's name, Moshe David Rakowsky, and heard about, well, he died in the very cold winter of 29 before the Germans ever came nearby. And he told us about going into hiding and all these incredibly dramatic stories. And I was just blown away. I'm scrawling these, names on cocktail napkins. I'm sure I was murdering the Polish names while I'm hearing about the murder of my great grandmother. And I was just transfixed. And I didn't know what to do with it. Like a lot of people who hear their family stories, I didn't quite know what to make of it. But I went back to my newspaper job, and 2 newspapers later, I was the Providence Journal, and I went to hear Elie Wiesel speak, and he said, we have to listen to the survivors. And that prompted me to go and start to ask to interview my cousin Sam. I was a young reporter, and it became the most important story of my life. And he started with telling me, again, you see the lumberyard behind him as a little boy with his brother Yisrael and his cousins Masha Dina and Samuel Bonnick. This was a classic case I'm sure you've heard from many, many people in this town. There was, both he and his cousin Samuel had one Rakowsky and one Bonnick for a parent. Everybody's marrying sisters and brothers because, the population was such that that's who there was, right? Anyway, so he told me about this wonderful time he had growing up and what a great life it was. And of course, I wanted to get to the bad part. I wanted to get to the drama of the war and everything. And I just kept, I couldn't stop asking him the same question over and over and over again. How did you survive? What were you thinking about? Did you have a prayer? I mean, I was just really riveted by that question of how you could be so resilient, how you could be so optimistic. And finally, one day, he said, what was I thinking about? I was thinking about a piece of bread, and I wanted something more grand. And it's just interesting how we look for those answers in our relatives. So, I continued to interview him, and I wound up writing a first person magazine story for the Providence Journal in the late 80s. And he had never talked to anyone before. He had never spoken publicly. He'd started to go to some of the survivors gatherings that were happening in the 80s. Like I said, that miniseries came out, and it was just, people were just starting to percolate. And I asked him, I said, why haven't you never talked about this before? And he said, I didn't think anyone wanted to hear it. I didn't think anyone cared. So after that, he was very happy that the story came out. I was like feeling like, brought up like David, and that objectivity, and we don't really show any opinion or anything. And then here I was showing, my heart on my sleeve with my cousin's story. And we met in New York for this celebratory brunch. And I said, do you think you'll ever go back to Poland? And he said, I might. And I said, well, if you do, I'd love to tag along. Maybe my journalistic skills could be of some use. So in 1991, I did just that. I went with this guy who looked a lot like my then late father and sounded just like my grandfather. And I think that's another thing that unites us in this feeling that pretty soon we're not going to have anyone else left who sounded like them, the voices of the old country. And I know I'm already, I have so many digital files saved of Sam Says, and every time I talk to him, I didn't know if I was going to talk to him again. And just listening to his voice is something that, I miss already. But anyway, we hit the ground running in Poland, and he was, again, talking about how wonderful his childhood was and how he was one of the few survivors who was not bitter about Poles. He did not have this view that has been expressed to me many times at book events, that the Poles were the worst. He said a lot of Poles did, some small, some larger gestures and acts that helped save his life. And he was very much more positive about Poland and Poles throughout his life than many survivors. So we're driving down from Warsaw toward Krakow. The town where my family comes from is, I'm looking over this way because you guys are on the side here, so I'm going to try and look straight into the camera. We're driving down, and he's telling me, I go through here and I get like electric shocks. I know that our lumber yard had wood that went into this barn and that house. And it was something that I now realize how privileged I am to have been able to travel with a relative, with a survivor that could retrace. We weren't just retracing steps through camps and the war that was so awful, but also that life that was from before. And I know many, many friends who have gone back and tried to find a trace of their families, and there's nothing to be found. So I'm extra fortunate in that regard. But on the way down, Sam shares with me this tip he got. He heard from an old school chum's husband that this family of cousins named Rosenek, that they were massacred in hiding late in the war, but one cousin walked away. And he said, I think we should try to find her. And I'm like, of course we should try to find her. I couldn't believe he hadn't shared that before, because to me, this was the biggest thing. I had already, particularly as a younger person, been shocked by the feeling in Poland that, it was a graveyard. That's something that struck me extra, with more potence, in part because I had just come from covering this crime that had gotten national attention in Providence, in Rhode Island. Literally, I'd just flown from working around the clock on the murders of a lawyer, his wife, who was a librarian for Brown University, and their 8-year-old daughter. It was in a posh suburb where nobody ever gets murdered. And this was in the early 90s. And it had become national news. And I even wrote a feature story about how upset the police were when they discovered the child's body, which, many of them had a lot of trouble with that. And there I am in Poland, and you just see the sort of the mass scale of destruction of, a whole people. So, and no one seemed to bother with so many of these things. It was like so many people were lost. So that was hitting me pretty hard. But Sam thought, he was so confident, he was so embracing of the people he went to school with and families, people who his family had done business with. He's like, we're just going to go talk to some people, my friends, they're going to help us find. And that seemed like of course, all these people, they like you still. And so we started to go visit these friends. They served us these multi-course meals, homemade noodles and so forth. Now, to be, as a sideline, back when he was young, the Jews and the Gentile Poles did not break bread together. They were quite separate, and he would not have done this. But, we're not religious, and we had no problem doing this. Anyway, so we're sharing these meals, we're hearing stories. And then, in fact, the guy who gave him the tip, he's like, okay, so what about the Rosenka girl? We didn't know her first name right then. And immediately everybody just like stares into their soup. It's as if we'd brought up something that you could not discuss. And this happened again when we went to the home of the people who his father had handed over the lumberyard to, a guy that was a Gentile before the Nazis could take it. They wanted to give it, to who they wanted to have it. And so again, close family relationship. I think they had even left some belongings with those people before the roundup. Nothing. In fact, again, opulent meal, staring into plates, and I learned the 2 words of Polish, that my first 2 words of Polish besides please and thank you were nie wiem, meaning I don't know. And this was so reflexive again and again and again that I started picking up quickly in situations that people were not going to talk, even if Sam wasn't bothering to translate for me. So Sam was that first time that at Stefan and Sophia's house, he got very angry with them when they wouldn't help. And we went back to our hotel in Krakow. He had a conversation with Stefan that night. He said, I'm not coming back. You promised to help me. You're not helping me. I'm done. The next morning, Stefan calls and he says, Sam, I have a big surprise for you. It's just a fantastic discovery. You have to come. You have to come. So Sam quickly forgave him. Our expectations ballooned again. We rush back to town and we drive to this place. And then we stand at the top of the driveway for quite a long time while all these negotiations are happening. I didn't know what was going on. And finally, we're allowed to go in this house. And I'm expecting, like, we're going to see the cousin. This is going to be the big discovery. But no, we're brought into this room, and Sophia, his schoolmate, is peeling off layers and layers of tablecloth. And she says, to look, not to touch, not to take. And what did they reveal? It was the dining room table from Sam's childhood home. And then we're both reacting like we were going to like take a table, like, put it on my back and take it to the plane. I don't think so. So there was this edge. And then the man whose house it was spent all this time regaling us with tales of what a great deal he got at auction after the Jews were rounded up. So this, because Sam wasn't translating, but it was all recorded. So I was able to get it word for word translated later. And it was just, I was incredulous that this guy was sitting here telling the man whose table it was about the great deal he got at the auction of all the Jewish belongings that the Nazis organized in my family's lumberyard after the Jews were carted off to Belzec. So there was a lot of that, a lot of people that didn't seem to have talked to anyone who was affected by these events for maybe ever. And nonetheless, Sam was more pragmatic.
Have you seen traffic problem? Let us know when it's safe.
Eva, you need to mute. So the thing is, that same guy, this guy that had the table, Sam said to him, hey, did you ever hear what happened to my cousins, the doulas? I think they hid around here somewhere. And this guy, without missing a beat, he said, oh yeah, they're buried next door in the root cellar. So we go walking next door. And in fact, and there's another farmer standing there. We don't know what kind of reception we're going to get. And this guy said, yes, this was a tragedy for your family and for mine. He said for 18 months, his father had kept this family of 5 adults with the surname Dula, cousins of ours, safe in a cavern under a barn. And then one night, these assailants came, all these gunmen, not just a couple people, like a lot of gunmen. They beat his father unmercifully. He wouldn't reveal, they said, give us your Jews, and he wouldn't give anyone up. And he just said, you can go ahead and beat me, but I'm not gonna help you. So they went away, and they clearly were tipped off by someone in the neighborhood. And a short while later, they came back and they went right to where they were hiding. And they were marched up on a hill, and they continued to abuse this man, Kazimierz Soto. But ultimately they shot the Jews. They did not hurt him. I mean, they did not shoot him. And then they forced him to strip the bodies and bury them. So this family was traumatized because this man died he died early because of this shock and this trauma. And to this day, we have visited this family many, many times. And now it's that man's great-grandson that we just visited in September, and his 2 sons. And we have this incredible bond because of how they tried to save our family. They weren't successful, but what's really revealing is that they have been penalized. They have suffered a stigma in their community for generations because they hid Jews. So the title of my book, Jews in the Garden, has 2 meanings. One is that, in fact, Poland was a garden for Jews for centuries. It was the man who welcomed Jews to Poland, King Casimir. Well, another guy welcomed them. He codified their civil rights. And my family hometown is Kazimierz Wielka. A lot of things are named after this same king, but he really was a hero for Jews because, as many of you may know, by the time World War II started, there were more Jews living in Poland than just about anywhere else in the world. And they'd enjoyed more rights than in many places. Now, in 1996, the man that first told us about the doulas, my cousin Sam was, as you probably, many of you know about the U.S. Shoah Foundation, USC, and it became, it's all those records are harbored at USC. Sam sat for interviews. They tried to take every oral history of every survivor. Sam had his interviews in the US, but then he said, I want to go on location. I want to do the rest of it in Poland. So was called then the Spielberg Foundation. They said, okay. So we go roaring back to this farmland, this farm, as you can see. And this woman was hired to interview these guys. She was from Krakow and a film crew from Krakow. And he told the same story about what happened to the doulas on tape. And that's my cousin Sam on the right. So while this interview is taking place, we had some journalists with us. We had a whole sort of entourage that the whole community still remembers. I'm kind of on the outskirts because I'd already heard the story before, and it wasn't really new. It was just kind of the pageantry of it all. And I noticed this woman and her young son kind of appearing in the farmyard, and I hadn't seen them before. And I was really curious, who were they? Well, it turns out that they lived there. They lived on this farm. It's this man's niece. Her name is Danuta Soto Agorek. Funny thing about that part of Poland, a lot of surnames are from things found in nature. Agorek is cucumber. And this other family that hid my family, their name is Mleko, milk. There are all these very kind of common names, which I'm sure that we could trace that back to medieval times. But anyway, so this guy, Władysław Soto, is telling what happened, and his niece is looking on with a very shocked look on her face because he has never told her that story. This is a story that is so taboo. No one talked about hiding Jews even long after the war. This woman is a couple years younger than me, and she had never been told. Now, her father died young, but still, he never told her. And in fact, she was like, what is he doing here? He doesn't even live on this property. So that was all, it was all strange. But what was wonderful that day, this interviewer, she went over and she told the son, he was 8 years old. And she said, your family did something very, very good. Always remember that. So she also went up to Danuta and she said, she was talking to her. And Danuta said, I never knew anything about this, but in school, the kids used to tease me and call me doula. I didn't know why. And they teased me about the Jews in the garden, in my garden. So it's the sadness of our going from being in a garden to being physically planted in a garden that is a little too on the nose for a Holocaust story, but that's where the title comes from. And that's emblematic of what we discovered, that there were a lot of Jews that were hiding safely with good Poles in the hinterlands of Poland. and they were killed late in the war by Polish partisans. This is illegal to say in Poland under a law passed in 2018 that said that the only narrative about World War II is that Poles were heroes and victims. It is literally against the law to describe Poles as perpetrators in any way. And this was shocking because they're basically mandating a version of history and saying the facts don't matter. They did have decades of communist rule during which there was so little discussion of, I mean, Jews were removed from the narrative of the Holocaust. There were fascists and there were socialists, and there was no mention of Jews being particularly being targeted for execution. So that taboo on talking about hiding Jews, you could see how these layers, these threads of suppression, of discussion of true facts, made it easier for this right-wing populist government to have its way with history. And that's what I find so disturbing. And I never thought it was going to resonate around the world like it has. I'm just stopping for a moment to ask David, I'm seeing that it's 1:15. Should I stop for Q&A or?
I don't think we have to be strict about ending at 3:00, but if anybody has a question right now, maybe based on what Judy has already revealed, maybe feel free to ask it now. And if not, then
I
continue.
can go on.
Yeah, please do. No, I don't want you to feel constrained in any way.
Okay. So anyway, so as you can gather, I've been to Poland many times, and I think 7 or 8 of those with Sam. This image you see now, you can see how vibrant this guy was. He was 90 in that picture. And the other thing, so I kept on this quest for the cousin through court documents. I knocked on every kind of door you can knock on. We had some amazing experiences. And again, the doors were not exactly opening even before this law was passed. There was this brief period after the fall of communism when archives and records, were open, at least to academics who knew what to look for and where to go. But generally, it was incredibly frustrating to try to get anything factual. I also had the challenge of looking for a woman whose surname easily could have changed just through marriage. But on one occasion, I went back to the town and said, "Oh, I forgot to check the they have the marriage records in the city hall under, the Catholic records." And I thought, well, maybe she married a Catholic and they'll have, her new surname. So it was a box I hadn't checked. I went back there and the city clerk told me, she said, "We do not keep the records of the Mosaic people. We do not keep those records. And besides," she said, "if she had married a Catholic, she could not have lived here. Her children would have been ridiculed. She would have had no peace. She could not have lived here." And I thought that was one of the most revealing encounters, aside from all the formal and official acts of rebuffing this quest, that I was blown away by. She acted like, how dare we think about living there after the war? And it's part of this complexion that is really, really sad and daunting, because in my more recent times there, the younger people are very eager to find out about, the Jews that live there, and they know they're missing something, and they know that something really bad happened, but they have been taught nothing. In other countries, they teach the Holocaust, they teach a lot more, but this has been resisted in Poland. There are good people doing a lot of, I call them memory workers, that they're fixing up cemeteries, and you may, this group may know a lot about this, but not, but on a town level, it is pretty challenging. So I continue this quest for Henya, and I'm not going to give any spoilers, but that is the thread through the book. But we also discovered other families of relatives who were killed in hiding, again by Polish partisans. The reason why I tell you the story of the doulas in the detail that I did is because I wound up getting a very, very robust court file with after a lot of trouble and a lot of sourcing, hopscotching. And the file revealed that, in fact, squads of members of the underground in very organized military fashion carried out that massacre and others in the area. In fact, 20 men were charged with murder and other offenses in connection with the killing of the doulas and another distant relation family in another town nearby. A series of events, and some of them even were, death sentences were meted out, but there were quickly, they got amnesty, they got all the rights of all veterans, and there was no stigma whatsoever for having been convicted. In fact, I even said that to Danuta on one of my visits. I said, what about the partisans who were charged and convicted? You guys have this stigma. What about them? And she says, oh, nobody really, no, they don't bother them. There's no problem. So there is a real double standard, and that's really troubling. So I went through a lot of the usual boxes we check, as David, has a similar professional background as me: court documents, door knocks, tracking through sources. And I have to say, it's a whole lot harder to do, not only when you don't have all the languages, because Poland, wasn't a country for 150 years. In fact, my grandfather had left to evade conscription in the Tsar's army. And so the records are in Russian, Yiddish, Polish, you name it. And also they're not kept in the kind of order that we would expect. And you really need a lot of luck if you're going to find anything. When I first went to the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw in the early 90s, I saw heaps of records just piled on tables. It's why when people go back, it's very hard to find threads of history. But we found out a lot given all those challenges. And but Sam and I, one of the central tensions of the book is Sam was sometimes on the search, sometimes not on the search. He started getting very involved in the March of the Living. I imagine that many of you know the March of the Living is was annual, bringing high school students from all over the world together, mostly Jewish, and showing them the sites of the Holocaust. And then they march from Auschwitz to Birkenau, and then they go to Israel to show sort of the rebirth and the safe place for the Jewish people. How can we say that today? But Sam became like a rock star on the March of the Living. His bus was the most sought after because of his dry humor, and he just came alive talking to kids. And that's what was amazing at the funeral where I just was 2 weeks ago. All these people came from the March of the Living in their jackets and singing the song. And it really was part of what really kept him going year after year. In fact, the last time I was with him in Poland was 2017. I think he went one more time in his early 90s. I mean, his wife was out of her mind while he was traveling there. But he had a drive to get back to Poland because he'd say, everywhere in the world, Israel, the United States, everyone says, where do you come from? When I'm here, this is where I'm from. This is my home. Warts and all, no matter what, this is where I'm from. And so Sam really did instill in me a connection to this beautiful land and some really wonderful people that I've met as a result, that most Jews, most Israelis don't really think of having modern connections with Poland and Polish people, but we have a lot of them. And it's just this countryside is just so beautiful. It really resonates with me. This is Sam on one of the times he was translating documents. We had this incredible pattern. I would find something, whether it's the court file or something else, and he'd say, I'd send it to him. He'd say, oh, I know all this already. I said, well, Sam, I think this is new. You might want to take a look at it. And then he'd stay up all night, or he'd just totally pour over these things. And then he'd call back the next day and he'd say, it's interesting. We did not know this. So we had this back and forth, and he just absolutely, absorbed all this material and all this stuff. And he was very riveted to it. I was just in Poland in September. We were invited back for, he was honored as the last Jew of his town. And there's some really wonderful people, including this high school teacher from a nearby town who took an early memoir that he wrote. And then she cobbled together material I sent and put out. This was the book launch of that. That word means remembrance. And it was just to talk about his life. And they had 3 or 4 days of, panel discussions and celebrations, and something at his old school, and, children singing songs in Hebrew and Yiddish, a lot of Fiddler on the Roof, and very, very sincere and earnest celebrations of what was Jewish culture there. And there's a group that's spreading these out through the whole area, and they're not in line with what was the ruling government until recently. But it was very touching, the efforts that they went to remember him. And he was on Facebook Messenger with tons of people from there all the time. And we had a meal with the family that hid him and 7 other relatives for 3 months. And then one of the reasons why he escaped the fate of other relatives was they thought it was too dangerous in the countryside. So they actually snuck into the Krakow ghetto. And then, of course, they proceeded to all be sent to other camps. But 6 of the 8 from that, the 4 you saw in the early picture and the parents survived, versus what we know happened in the countryside. So this is my cousin, and I miss him terribly. Anybody have any questions?
Isabel, go ahead. We can't hear you.
You go through the timeline of where he was from, from the time the Nazis took power, just geographically, which camps was he in? And
Yeah, he was, well, in his town, they didn't have a ghetto in that small town. So from 39 to the fall of 42, he was in his hometown. And then they went into hiding for 3 months and then into the Krakow ghetto in the fall of 42. The Krakow ghetto was liquidated on April 13th, 1943. He went to Plaszów, then to a place called Pionki, which was northeast of Warsaw. It was a labor camp. And then he benefited from a kind of Schindler-like guy, who had a munitions factory that he was working in. And he said, as the Red Army was advancing, this was in 44, he said, I need these Jews to rebuild, to reassemble my factory near Berlin. And so they went by train, went right by Auschwitz, but still they went on to Sachsenhausen. And they were the only Jewish prisoners at Sachsenhausen besides the, you probably know the story of the counterfeiters, the Jewish prisoners who were printing fake British pounds, and they were going to, eventually get to dollars. There's a movie out, you might have seen about that. Anyway, they were the only Jews there. And then in 45, he was sent on a death march. They emptied Sachsenhausen and they were marched toward the Baltic Sea we now know the plan was to, whoever survived was to drown the rest of them. I mean, that's how intent they were on eliminating all the Jewish prisoners. I went back with him to a reunion at Sachsenhausen. And he'd gone to a lot of events like that. But he was not in a death camp. He was in several labor camps. But he was also 17 and 39. So he was young and strong and able to manage.
Linda?
Yeah. So, in the case where all these partisans, were charged, was that case brought by like the former Soviet government against, the people, the Soviets that were then in power in Poland?
Yeah, there were a number of prosecutions. It's a good question. In the early 50s, they consider that a very Stalinist period of the whole, communist reign in Poland. And it's kind of curious because they really were not that intent on prosecuting people for killing Jews, right? That was an exception. But included in that case was, I think, the motive, the explanation, and that was that there was a whole array of partisans, right? It was a big umbrella. Everybody was a partisan. Everybody worked in the underground. And some of them did great work, helped the Allies. There were a few Jewish partisans, but then there were some that were clearly, right wing, the Indetzia, the Chłopski, Battaliani, and then there were some that were socialist. Well, apparently, some of the right wing guys killed some of the socialist guys, and so they were avenging that, and almost like they had this whole big case and they went ahead with it, So it's kind of curious, but also coming in with the American journalist mindset, you think, oh, you just look this up. Well, none of this stuff was public. The trials weren't public. The filings weren't public. So, everything was closed. So if there was a a goal of punishing someone who had killed a socialist, by getting the word out that you're going to get punished for it, because it was all secret. I don't know how you got that sort of deterrent effect, it was strange. But it was definitely a slap on the wrist would be too strong. Like hardly any of these guys spent any time locked up at all. And many of them had many. One guy that I focus on in the book, I think he was accused of killing 14 Jews. And, except for when he was initially arrested, he maybe spent a couple days in jail. So even though they brought the prosecutions, it didn't seem like it was a real high priority. So has anybody here been to Poland? How long ago?
Well, in my case, I've been there several times. The first time was in 1983 or 84, when it was still under the Soviet government. But I've been there quite a few times. Saddened to see the right wing tilt now, and hoping that that might change.
Yeah, well, the election results were quite inspiring.
Yeah, and we're seeing this, as Andy can speak to. We're seeing this in Lithuania. We're seeing this right wing tilt, this effort to distort the history throughout Europe.
Well, the 18 to 29-year-olds were the decisive voters in the October 15th election, and they voted to throw out the right-wing guys. So we'll see what happens if the young people can save the country. Where'd Andy go? Andy.
He's there. He needs to unmute.
Hi. Sorry, you broke up.
No. So I think that I mentioned you in the context of understanding the political climate in Eastern Europe and your personal experience with Lithuania.
Lithuania is, it may be a little different than Poland in some respects. Many of the same pulls in both directions, but the folks I've been dealing with over there are quite enlightened and quite there's a great deal of sympathy and interest in getting to the truth of what happened there during the war. It's a little different in some respects because Lithuanian partisans at the very beginning of the war were deeply aligned with the Nazis. I mean, they saw the Germans as their liberators from the Soviet Union, which had annexed Lithuania in 1940, and there was it's taken a long time to understand the play of both of the various sides. For the Jews who were in Lithuania, the Soviets were clearly the second worst thing that could happen to them, and from the Lithuanian non-Jewish Lithuanians' point of view, it was exactly the opposite. So. But in recent years, I mean, the country is full of memorials, restored synagogues, as not as synagogues, but as various things. and it's there's still an ongoing argument, in some quarters, but it's trouble. It's troubling, except it takes 50 or 60 years to even get to the point where you're even dealing with these questions. Unlike because you're under the thumb of the Soviets for all those years. Makes a big difference. I'm curious what kind of success you're having with the book. Are you getting much attention with this story around the country?
Actually, yeah. Well, the New York Times book review by a leading World War II historian, and the New York Times saying it was a recommended book really helped. So that has,
great.
It really makes a difference. But I have a lot of stuff planned, but I'm going to be curious about what the war, I might have had, let's put it this way. I think Jewish audiences will continue to be interested, but I'm concerned about what's happening in our country right now, in general. And the crossover audiences might not be as abundant. I'll just put it that way. I don't know.
Yeah. We're obviously seeing a lot of, who knows?
It's interesting. I met this woman. I narrated my audiobook in Boston, and around the same time, there's a woman who's written a book called Irina's Gift. It's not out in the US yet, but she narrated in the same studio, and the producers put us together, and she just got back from London. Her book, she's originally Australian, and she just had her debut of her book in London, and everything got canceled. So I was like, whoa. And she said she said she felt really unsafe in London. So I just share that.
Yeah.
But I have to say that I do have optimism about the future in Poland after this election. It is the bright spot on the landscape right now. And I've met a lot of people that are working to do good things there. They also have a parliamentary system. So we'll see how the power sharing goes and what happens to these issues. Because what the government has been doing with this law, this 2018 law, is using it as a club to go after academics that have, I was worried about making this point that Polish partisans killed Jews because no one had written that. That was the news, if you will, of my book. However, it's very well settled on the academic level. If you know Jan Grabowski, Jan Gross turned the world upside down when he wrote Neighbors. And some people think that the backlash to Neighbors, about Jedwabne, was what gave rise to this right-wing government that Poles could not handle. And I go into this in detail in the book. They couldn't handle being the bad guys because they're so invested in being victims. And so that's a theory. But so after the 2018 law was passed, Grabowski and a woman named Barbara Engelking were sued. And anyone who knows anything about American law knows that, or journalists, that you can't libel the dead. Well, in fact, they brought a libel case against these guys, claiming that these academics had libeled the late uncle of this woman by saying that he had helped, had betrayed Jews and gotten them killed. It's called Still Night, or I forget how you say it in English, but anyway, this is a 3-volume book. It's a massive 1,000-page tome with gazillions of footnotes. And this was one incident. These books by the academics documenting, Poles killing Jews, betraying Jews, is really, it's almost impossible for a person to read without, it's soul killing. It's just a recitation of very, very, very grim facts. And that was why my goal was to try to provide something a little more readable, because it's just so sad. And I did get blurbs from Grabowski and Gross. And in fact, the review in the New York Times said that what I was writing about in a more, popular way was what academics had already settled. Now, the Polish government doesn't see it that way. They're saying none of this is settled. And what was really amazing during our, recent visit was on the day that the last day of the celebrations, they were in another town nearby. They were beatifying a Polish family that was killed for harboring Jews. The Olma family hid a group of 8 Jews in a very small town, and they were killed. It was a couple and their 6 children and 1 about to be born. It's become a bit controversial because they also beatified that child that was described as being baptized in her mother's blood, or his mother's blood, during these killings, which that's a whole Catholic issue about baptism and so forth. But what made this political is that this family, they were, properly got all the celebration that Yad Vashem bestows upon the righteous unto the nations in 1995. So this is a real case. They were, what they did was, their sacrifice was enormous. But the timing was right on the eve of the elections and fit into the government narrative that all Poles save Jews. So in 2023, that's on the table. That's part of the election campaign. All Poles save Jews, all Poles are heroes. And so this beatification was done with 1,000 cardinals, live streamed from Rome. I think it was 3 weeks before the election. And it was, and at that event, and I'm going to answer that libel suit question I see someone asked. At that event, the president of Poland, someone said, how many Poles were killed for hiding Jews? And he said, thousands, tens of thousands. Split screen to where we're listening to a priest give a lecture. This is in September. And someone asked the priest, the priest asked the audience, how many Poles were killed for hiding Jews? And the audience said, tens of thousands. He said, no. Thousands. No. And this guy is like, he's a professor and he's a good priest. And he said, no, we have to deal in facts. There was a total of between 600 and 800 Poles who were actually killed by the Nazis for hiding Jews. The fear and intimidation was incredible and widespread, and people were very much made to be afraid, but the actual punishment was that small in a country of 38 million now. And so that's why academics like Grabowski say that the actual punishment, and you should friend him on Facebook. He's incredible. He's a professor in Ottawa, Canada. The actual number of, the betrayal versus the number who actually suffered for hiding Jews, there's just no comparison whatsoever. Now, that libel suit, which did get global coverage a few years back, brought on behalf of the niece of the late mayor, the Warsaw judge who heard that case said that, in fact, it was a civil action, wasn't criminal, said that, in fact, they had libeled the memory of this man and ordered these academics to issue a formal apology to her. In that decision, and I quote from it in my book, this judge said that your right to pride in your country, to feeling good about your nation's history, is equal to all other rights. In other words, I mean, they don't have the exact same rights as we do, but still, that it's just as you have a right to pride. Nothing about facts, nothing about truth. You have a right to feel good about your country. Sounds a little bit like DeSantis, not to get political here, but it sounds a little bit like what's being said around here about how everyone has a right to feel good and not to be upset. That decision was ultimately overturned on appeal, and that's the reason why I'm really happy about this election, is that there's some independence left in the judiciary in Poland, and I hope the attack on that independence will stop with this change in the political future. So had anyone heard about the beatification of the Almas? I think that's interesting, because it was like they really tried to make it really, really big news. And I'm finding that a lot of people, didn't know about it, but it was kind of surprising from this Pope.
Judy, can you talk about how it feels to go forward without Sam?
Well, I mean, I feel like I asked a lot of him. 99 is pretty good run. And, I was saying to his daughter that it's like he'd been around so much, you just kind of think, oh, he's always going to be there. I'm always going to be able to call him. And, I still want to be able to call him. But it's weird. At first, I was very involved with the funeral and everything. And it's very pragmatic. Of course, he's 99. Everyone, he lived a good life. But that doesn't take away from the partnership we had in the Polish stuff. I mean, nobody else cares about it like he did.
Anybody have any final comments or questions?
David, there's still the question of what happened to the libel suit on the.
No, she
Yeah, I
just
said,
answered that. She
yeah.
just answered
Okay.
that. It's basically, I think if I could boil it down, it ultimately was resolved in a satisfactory way. But the stench from it lingers. I think we could
Well put.
agree. Yeah. Judy, thank you so much.
Linda
Yeah.
had something.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So did Sam have any children or grandchildren?
Oh yeah. Yeah. He had, just in my talk in LA, his son and daughter-in-law flew down from San Francisco for the talk, and he's got 2 grandchildren in California, and then his daughter in Chicago is she's married and has 2 kids, and there's 1 great grandchild. And I would be remiss if I did not tell you that there is a short documentary out called Jack and Sam. I don't know if it's playing near you, but it is about the reunion of Sam and Jack, who were both in Pyeongchang together. And they were reunited after Sam was speaking in 2022 at this Holocaust Museum gala in South Florida. And Jack looks across the room and he's like, I know that guy. And so they came together, and it's a really nice story about these two survivors who come together in their late 90s. And they did make it to a couple schools to just tell kids, don't hate. And they said, and it's in the film, it's really sweet. And it's got Oscar buzz. So I met the director when I was in LA, and he has got executive producers. This is a whole process. Getting, an Academy Award is like a whole thing. Sarah Silverman and Juliana Margolis are signed on as executive producers to try to help its chances. So
That's wonderful.
yeah. So he lives on.
Wonderful. And he lives on through your terrific work.
Thank you. Thanks a
Any
lot.
final questions or comments? We thank you so much,
Thank you
Judy.
so much.
I actually have one final question. Where do you recommend people buy the book these days? There are all sorts of options to buying it, and where do you direct people to go?
Well, I love to support independent bookstores because they're the ones having author events for people like us. There is an online independent bookshop.org, I think it's called. It's in my email signature. I can forward it to David. Obviously, to my mind, you want to get the book. Like it's on Audible. I narrated it. I had to audition to narrate it. And I had to train to narrate it. And I really don't want to have to pronounce all those Polish words ever again.
Let me type it into the chat area. What is it again?
I can type it.
Okay.
There. There's bookshop.org.
Okay.
And also, someone asked how to contact me. Just put my email address in here.
Great.
But wherever books are sold.
Yes, it's widely available.
I did a talk at Radnor Library in Wayne, Pennsylvania, I don't know, about a month ago. So ways out there, but
It's on the main line. Yep. Okay. Thanks again. Thanks everybody for joining today. And Judy, thanks again so much for joining us and sharing your story, a little bit of your story. We appreciate it very much. And we wish you all the best. And we wish safety to your stepson who's serving on the front lines down in the south of Israel.
Amen.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.